Good morning. We still have a few folks wandering in, but I'll start us off with prayer before I hand it over to our dear Ray Suarez. God be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, you are our eternal home. Be present with us this day. Stir in our hearts and minds, and allow us to hear your wisdom. May we learn the stories of others and be moved by them. And because of this learning, may we learn to love as you love. In your holy name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. As you all well know, Ray Suarez is an author, a journalist, a reporter, a podcaster, has many tremendous accolades. I feel really privileged that we get to know Ray also as a faithful friend here at St. Columba's. And Ray came to us earlier in the spring and said, "Can I talk about my upcoming book?" And of course the answer is yes. What a wonderful treat to have Ray here talking about his newest book, We Are Home, here with us this morning. So without further ado, it's over to you.
Thank you,
Ray.
When Adeline and I were talking about dates for a book talk, one choice was Memorial Day, and I wasn't really sure about that. The other was the final Sunday of the program year, and here we are. And for those of us in school recently enough to remember what the last week of class was like, as the weather improved and people started to disappear, you never know exactly whether you're going to be restless or attentive or what, but here you are, and thank you. I really count the opportunity to write this book as one of the great privileges of my career, because it took me to all kinds of wonderful, unexpected places that illustrate what the country is like in the 21st century, to the largest Catholic church in the largest Catholic archdiocese in America, in Los Angeles, to go to repeated Sunday masses that were filled out to the back doors with standing room only in the back, 20,000 families on the roll, St. Emilius Church, to an enormous Hindu temple in the Dallas suburbs, where, like everything built in Texas, there has to be acres of parking surrounding it, to a dairy farm in Wisconsin, where the cows are lovingly spoken to in Spanish all day, not something that they had counted on being born in Iowa, to in my hometown of New York City, the amazing borough of Queens, which is now a place that a half century after All in the Family was on television, let's just say Archie Bunker would not recognize Queens the way it is today. So as I was meeting more people, and as I was doing more reporting, and as I was doing more traveling, the people in the book moved from being sort of characters who populate this America closer to the center of what I had to say. I really Ouija'd this book, put my hands on the tiller and just let it go from letter to letter to sort of see what the reporting told me as a story about what was going on. And the people moved from just being characters telling their stories to really the beating heart of the book. That Ouija game was in response to different impulses coming from events, from our politics, and driven increasingly by the shifting tone in the American conversation about immigration in recent years, which has become uglier, more divisive, more panicky, and more exclusionary. It's been contested terrain for a while. I mean, if you're an adult that's old enough to remember the last couple of family feuds about this subject, you know that this is not something that's settled, one and done, once and for all, and then we just proceed from there. We, as a people, have been arguing for a long time about what to do with the people who are here with no legal right to live here, who work here long term. A population that's grown steadily in the decades since the Simpson-Mazzoli law in 1986 that offered a path to legal residence for millions of undocumented people. Amnesty. Now, more than 35 years later, there are many millions, 12 to 15, even more, million people living here with no legal status, millions more who have come in legally. We do allow something close to 1 million people a year to enter the country legally. Millions more, as you know from watching the evening news, trying to come in. And the United States is unquestionably a country changed by their presence. But we're still recognizably us. And that's another strand of this story that I think is really important to stress right now. Different, modified, changed at the edges. What you hear on the radio may sound a little different when you turn on the radio. The mix of businesses on a local commercial street might be a little different, but it's still us, and it's still America. And really, what are we so afraid of? People might think back to that 1986 law as the big milestone in that transformation, but it's not really. The change really goes back to 1965. The Hart-Celler Law, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, a much bigger deal that turned the axis of American immigration away from the Western Europe-centered quota system in place since the 1920s, that along with other rules already in place, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, there's one that'll win you a trivia game one night at bar trivia. These laws together effectively closed the United States to much of the world. Opinion makers were really disturbed by the 1920s, by the human waves that arrived in this country from the mid-1840s to the early 1920s. Roughly 75 years of intense immigration from Europe that brought with it alien religions, alien ideas, alien political theories, and the people who sort of were the straws that stir the drink in American society said, no more of that, and slammed the door. That Congress could control. What also came were things that Congress couldn't have predicted and couldn't have controlled. Worldwide economic depression starting in 1929. A decade of world war starting in the mid-30s. And a baby boom in an America after the war that was now home to half of all the industrial productivity on the planet, with a world in ruins and our industrial base intact. The 1910 census. So cast your mind, many of you will remember the 1910 census. As that new anti-immigrant consensus was building, about 1 in 7 people living in the country was born somewhere else in the world. By 1960, it was 1 in 20. The percentage of native-born had been declining through much of the 20th century because of war and depression and, the unpredictables of life. 1 in 20. And because people hadn't been coming in large numbers in a long time, the U.S. had essentially digested, absorbed that big early 20th century immigrant wave. And the average foreign-born person, counted in the 1960 census, was far older than the average American. Today, we talk about immigrants as younger workers and their children heading for elementary schools around the country. In 1960, immigrants were your grandma and grandpa. not the people filling up the kindergarten starting in September. Not 20-something new arrivals trying to get a job at your company. The birth countries of foreign-born Americans had sent immigrants to the U.S. who were almost entirely white. From Germany, from Ireland, from Canada. In the 2020 census, the only majority white country on the list of top 10 birth countries of foreign-born Americans was Canada. And increasingly, even Canadian immigrants are non-white, of East Asian, African, and Caribbean descent. In the book, we hear the stories of new Americans from every corner of the globe about their journeys to the country, their struggles, how they got the hang of being American. Because much of the anti-immigrant rhetoric you hear in this country is based on the idea that these new people will never get the hang of being American, I thought it was really important to hear from them and their journeys on this soil. What do we hear now about the newest arrivals? That they're criminal, that they're diseased, that they don't learn English, that they are, like all immigrants, yes, they're foreign, obviously they're foreign, that's part of the problem, but they're, oddly enough, in today's rhetoric, too foreign to learn to be like us. So you hear, quite frequently, well, when my great-grandparents came, they played by the rules. This is a very interesting rhetorical trick that a lot of people play in our debates now. They say, my great-grandparents played by the rules. What they omit, conveniently, is that there were no rules. For much of the time from 1790 to 1924, there were hardly any rules, and if you got here, you were basically in. You hear stories of grandparents who quickly learned English, stepped right off the boat and were quoting Chaucer and Shakespeare shortly thereafter, when they know deep down that Nonna, she spoke a little English, but let's be honest, not that much. When I watch thousands of young men marching around a statue of Robert E. Lee chanting, "You will not replace us," and more ominously, "Jews will not replace us," I felt sorry for and sorry about these young men for a couple of reasons. For one thing, who's the you that will not replace them? It's me and my wife and my kids. And these men believe strongly that they are patriots, and yet they seem to not know their own country, the one they purport to love, because they deep down believe that America is a zero-sum game. That if someone gets something, that means inevitably that there's going to be less for them. A place where someone else's progress and productivity narrows their own horizons. That is a departure from centuries of what our patriots believed about the country. That the miracle of the place is that it's not a zero-sum game. I have no doubt that if I had begun to work that line of torchbearers, the microphone, their names would have included plenty of Clarks and Smiths and Jenkins, sure. But also Vogel and O'Leary and Santella and Schneider and Grabowski, because they themselves would be descendants of people who came here and for a long time experienced the same kind of marginalization and exclusion that they were suggesting we practice on others. When their own forebears came, many of them weren't, in the racial pseudoscience of the 19th century, white. When you read the Dellingham Report of 1914, you find that a congressional committee sat down and categorized 34 different races. A lot of Americans who had come through Ellis Island weren't, in the view of that commission, white. Certainly not the Santellas, certainly not the Slavs, certainly not the Jews of the Pale of Settlement in the western end of the Tsarist Empire. They were not good Anglo-Saxon stock from which to build the nation. These young men have so little faith in America, have so little grasp of our history, that they believe the great transformation, the amazing metamorphosis that makes Americans and made Americans out of their own forebears is something somehow that we no longer have the wit and the talent to do, that we can't repeat with people named Lopez and Hernandez and Chen and Suleiman. Just can't do it anymore. Furthermore, in the uglier, deeper recesses of the Great Replacement theory, it's the powerful, moneyed elites that are engineering large-scale immigration to the U.S. in order to steal their inheritance. And the birthright of these aggrieved white men is being taken away in a scheme engineered by shadowy Jewish forces who secretly run the country. This is the foundation stone of the Great Replacement theory, of the angry right-wing chat rooms that exist in some of the darker corners of the internet. It is a deluded, hateful, cramped, mean, dysfunctional belief to carry into the rest of this century, given what the rest of this century really looks like. It seeks to outright negate or somehow make suspicious and ugly the contributions new Americans make to getting the daily life of this country done. Whether it's picking your strawberries or milking your cows or bussing your restaurant tables and pounding your roof shingles, or inventing the future in Silicon Valley, or in a human genome lab in Boston. As I mentioned in the opening paragraphs of the book, I wrote a lot of it while I was living in China, a country that has made very different choices about immigration. China's birth rate, like ours, has cratered. The country is now losing population. China's population went down in the last census. It expects to lose between 300 and 400 million people by the middle of the century. Like a whole United States and a France thrown in for good measure. Less people than there are now. In coming decades, it may have severe troubles producing its food and manufactured goods, and very importantly, recruiting for the People's Liberation Army. There's big stuff at stake in all of this. One of the places I've talked about the differences between U.S. and China in immigration is China. Recently, I spoke at the U.S. consulate in Shanghai and told my entirely Chinese audience that U.S. attitudes toward immigration were very different from China's. And I said that without fear of contradiction. And at the end of the talk, one Chinese lady came up to me and said that that wasn't really fair and that wasn't really right. And I asked her, well, when I was living on Wuiwanlu in Shanghai, in the Shuwei district, my neighbors were very well aware that there was a foreigner living on the second floor of the apartment building. And I told her that if I had lived there another 30 years, become fluent in Chinese, worked in the local economy, nobody on my street would think of me as Chinese. Ever. Ever, ever. And the way the word foreigner is used in the Chinese language is very revealing. It carries a very different electrical charge of suspicion and outsiderness, not just passport status. It's something much deeper when you say foreigner in Chinese. And she laughed and conceded that those things were all true. Our, at first reluctant, then begrudging, then serially repeated great talent as a people has been to gather in newcomers from everywhere and watch them become us. No matter how aggrieved you are, young men in Charlottesville, about a future where you will not be a member of a presumed majority, large and in charge of everything, the country will still be essentially itself. We have to work on that asymmetry, where they have trouble seeing me as part of their America, and I have no problem seeing them as part of mine. A persisting asymmetry in view. One of the things I write extensively about in the pages of the book is the way immigration is transforming the religious life of this country. For much of American history, the patterns of immigration acted as a proxy for race. In a very diverse planet, almost all immigrants were white. And race acted as a proxy for religion. We had no statute that we wanted Christian immigrants only, but by putting out the welcome mat for and then writing into practice and statute that we wanted mainly European immigrants, it was predictable that the United States would become a country of Christians with a small scattering of Jews. Muslims and others were brought into the United States in the 19th century, but as property. If you look at the slave coasts of Africa, from that big bulge out on the Atlantic all the way down to Angola, the sources of the black people who were brought into this country as property, many of them were Muslim, but not allowed to practice their religion once they got here. So even as a nation of immigrants, this country, even as late as 1965, was almost entirely Christian, with a small, steady Jewish minority. By opening up the map of the world, junking the Asiatic Barred Zone Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and by getting rid of 1924 quotas and formulas, and bringing in more people from Asia, East and South, from Africa and Latin America, we remade the demographics of American religion in a few short years, even as the Americans of longer family histories were walking away from the religions of their forebears. So the map is really in motion. As you know, I very rarely quote Tucker Carlson, but he calls them legacy Americans. Many of you are legacy Americans. As legacy Americans decide they don't want to be church affiliated anymore, and many of the people coming in from other places in the world are still actively involved in the congregations of their heritage, in part because it helps them find their feet in America to be congregationally affiliated when they are new to the place. All perfectly makes sense. As the number of unaffiliated has grown, so has the number of Hindus, the number of Muslims from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. As more and more immigrants begin or continue their families' American journeys, not in religious and ethnic ghettos, not that just post-Ellis Island, old-fashioned style of, Little Italy and the Lower East Side in Manhattan, but now beginning their journeys on New Hampshire Avenue in Prince George's County, in places in Northern Virginia that have become huge. They're the best places to get Chinese food, for instance, in the area. Sikh gurdwaras and mosques and Buddhist temples, Spanish-speaking Pentecostal megachurches are joining the landscape on suburban arterial roads, along with First Presbyterian and giant non-denominational Protestant churches. One of the places I take the reader in We Are Home is to an enormous Hindu temple in the Dallas suburbs. Another is a growing multinational immigrant Muslim congregation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is, of course, where you would have guessed that I was referring to. And to a fascinating young Episcopal mission in Dearborn, Michigan, led by a seminary classmate of Joshua Daniels named Halim Shukher, a Lebanese VTS graduate who proudly told me he'd just gotten his green card when we met, who was asked by the Bishop of Michigan to grow an Arabic-speaking Episcopal congregation in a church whose foundation stone was laid by Mrs. Henry Ford. Father Halim leads a religiously diverse congregation, oddly, drawn from Israel and Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. Almost all of his flock was raised Christian. None were baptized as Anglicans. He's working on an Arabic translation of the Book of Common Prayer, something Thomas Cranmer probably never imagined. And in a very American move, adds an English summary at the end of his sermons, because the younger members of the congregation can't always easily follow everything that he preaches from the pulpit in Arabic. It's a new story and a very American one at the same time. If after I retire in the next few years, I could head to seminary for a graduate degree, one thing that a good scholar and social scientist could watch closely is what these new Americans do. Will they, as they acculturate, as their tenures in the U.S. lengthen, as their children reach adulthood and have their own children, become religiously more like their native-born neighbors, or for a time at least, remain somewhat distinct? That could mean they disaffiliate at a similar level to native-born Americans, even as they carry a distinctive set of facial features and skin tones into the future, but not carry their ancestral faith. Or it could mean, over time, converting. One of the people I profile in the book is a deacon in an Ethiopian church who came to the United States as a young teenager when he would have been recruited to fight in the Civil War in the Horn of Africa. His youngest congregants are no longer as familiar with the separate liturgical language used in Ethiopian worship. There is a separate language that you speak in church, Giz. Or, in fact, when he preaches, they're no longer as familiar with Amharic, which is the language of most of what's going on during the service. Will they marry out, these young people at the Ethiopian church? Will they marry out, join similar but more American congregations that worship in English? Will they marry Black Americans and become Baptist or AME congregants? A Hindu mother of 2 college-age sons said she thought both of her boys will marry in the faith, and if they don't, still remain Hindu. And her confidence is buoyed by the families she sees at Temple with intermarried couples in which both parents are encouraging their children in Hindu learning. Will a particularly American style of Islam grow in this country? One where more of the preaching and the teaching goes on in English, even as Arabic prayer remains central. In what ways will Muslim immigrant families resemble Roman Catholic families from over a century ago, who built churches, brought in priests and nuns from faraway countries to keep a bit of Croatia, of Poland, of Italy, of Ireland alive in the neighborhood, and then find that that ethno-cultural orientation just doesn't make the trip when they follow the new interstates out to the suburbs and now multi-ethnic congregations. It's all fascinating stuff. I think it will make for great scholarship in coming decades, even as the country becomes overall less religious. As I mentioned in my Advent talk, I find myself getting incredibly sentimental as I get older, and at the same time more hard-nosed and practical, which makes for a really odd mix. In the final chapters of the book, I talk at length about American ideals, about acceptance and tolerance and belief in the future, and about the real situation we find ourselves in today and the big chasm, the uncomfortable gap between the real and the ideal. About the real need for workers and children to keep the lumbering, clanking machinery of a continent-sized country moving forward, about the need to avoid the kind of intergenerational demographic danger waiting in coming decades in South Korea, where nobody has children anymore, in Russia, in Ukraine. I want us to include a little thinking about social utility when it comes to immigration, about the practical things like who do we think is going to take care of the largest generation of senior citizens in American history? Who do we think is going to do that? Who do we think is going to help you with your meds, help you get in and out of the tub, help you cook dinner? Who? And where do they come from? Right now, 14% of the people who live in this country were born somewhere else in the world, and over half of the home health care workers working in the United States were born somewhere else. And that number is only going up. In Japan, which accepts very few immigrants, which makes it really hard to enter and stay, the fastest growing job for Japanese in their 60s and 70s is providing daily health care for people in their 90s. Where they are now, we will be, and we really have to think about it, and we really have to talk about it, and we're not doing either. Along with the practical, hard-nosed, green eye shade calculation about alternative American futures, about the beautiful stories immigrants told me about becoming American and the things they learned along the way, we have to be both fully marinated, fully present to our ideals, who we say we are, who we think we are, who we like to tell the rest of the world that we are, and really very realistic about what life in this country is going to be like in 2040 and 2050 and 2060 and beyond. And my publisher did not get me the box of 40 books that I asked for in time for me to talk to you. But you know, there are other ways of acquiring the book. So I really, if you've got, it's a great beach read. Right there with your Sidney Sheldon and your Jackie Collins, your David Baldacci, your James Patterson. This is definitely one of those page turners as you sit underneath your umbrella and put on sunscreen, please. So I would urge you to read it. You will meet some amazing, wonderful, eye-opening, surprising people with unbelievable stories. So I hope you do take the opportunity to read the book, and let's talk about immigration in the time that we have left. There's the mic, set at a sort of medium height so people can, many different people from many different places will be able to reach that mic. One of our taller congregants is going to.
Of course it's not on. No. Yeah,
there we go.
Now it's on. My apologies for my back. I'm that homogenized person that my grandparents and great-grandparents stopped telling the story of where they came from Sweden, from Germany, from Scotland. I think there's some damage that happened to us when they tried to homogenize themselves and stop telling the stories. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I had a very interesting conversation about language with a teacher in Chicago named Mario, who said, you know, maybe America should stop asking me to be less than I am by asking me not to speak Spanish. He's a Mexican adult naturalized person, all his children born in the United States. And instead, America could enjoy the fact that I am more than they ask me to be, and fully conversant in multiple languages and able to move easily in the world in those two languages. I think that old-fashioned idea about assimilation and acculturation is sort of, in a lot of places, dying on the vine. And we talk more easily now and more commonly now about cultural competence and being able to code switch and comfortably move in different environments. And that may be the new style. When I write about riding on the 7 train in Queens out toward Flushing, next time you're in New York, stop staring at the Empire State Building and get on the train and go out to Queens, where some of the best food in New York is being served, but also it's just a jaw-dropping experience to be in what is now one of the most diverse counties in the United States. And piling onto my train was a cricket team made up of high school age South Asians. And they were a mixed group of both native-born and Asian-born kids. And you could tell in their accents. So there they are, talking about what teenage boys talk about, but in that magical, musical, mellifluous South Asian Indian English, and sounding like queens, but all looking the same. And as we make that big curve toward the end of the 7 train, Citi Field comes into view, and one of them says, "Dude, I think there's a game today." And the other guy says, "Yeah, who wants to watch baseball?" And then a third guy pipes in, "Yes, it's just a more boring version of cricket." And I thought, at that moment, we're going to be all right. We're going to be all right. Those guys don't have to be any less what they are to fit in this new America. They will be perfectly at home in it, both transforming the country around them and being transformed by that country every year of their lives here. We tend to give too little credit to America for changing the people who come here, and give the people who come here too much credit for changing America. We forget how transformational the experience of coming here and staying here is. And if you talk to people who go back to their hometowns, what do they say? They say, "Yeah, it was nice. It was nice to be home. It was nice to look around, but I don't belong there anymore. Or I don't know anybody there anymore. Or all the people who were my neighbors when I was there have moved on. So that's not my place." They feel more at home in New Jersey and in Arlington County and in the Atlanta suburbs than they do back in that other place. America transforms them. It changes them year after year after year. So let's lean into that instead of lamenting in this sort of nostalgic gush an America that's no longer with us and really isn't part of our future anymore. Let's get over it. That's not who we are anymore. That America where the best thing you could do is stop being who you were. We no longer hold that up as a model, as an ideal, as an aspiration. We're doing something different now. Those guys with Home Depot torches around the statue of Robert E. Lee just don't seem to have gotten the memo yet. But America's moving on, and we can either make this really hard, and that is a completely possible thing. When you have a candidate for national office talking about vermin poisoning the blood of the country and stuff like that, that's pretty harsh rhetoric. And you wouldn't have heard it out of the mouth of candidates from either party in 64, 68, 72, 76, 80, and on and on and on. Vermin and people poisoning the blood of the country is taking us somewhere new. And we either want to go there or we will decide we don't. Stay tuned. But we can make this really hard, the journey to 2050, when we will be a country where a slim majority of Americans trace their ancestry to Asia, Africa, and Latin America rather than Europe. Or it can be really easy. When Justin Bieber sings with Luis Fonsi and has a worldwide hit with Despacito, what do you grumble about that? It's sort of this cute pop song. Oh, relax, relax. And Despacito is actually very well-made pop. But there's a reason why Justin Bieber puts himself forward to sing with Luis Fonsi and make a worldwide hit. That's America to the rest of the world. That's our shop window with our best selves in the window for sale. And I don't know why it makes us so upset, but it seems to make us upset. John.
What do we need to do educationally, corporately, legally, community-wise, to help these immigrants today be all they can be, to help us be an even better America?
What I ask for in the book, and what I would suggest to all of you here today, is that we stop looking at immigration, capital I, immigration, as one huge amorphous problem that has to all be taken care of at once, which is impossible, which is why we don't do it, which is why the gears of our legislatures have seized up and are no longer really accomplishing anything on this area. What we should do immediately is look at the people the desperate people who are showing up at the border as something separate and distinct from the people who've been living here 10 and 12 and 14 years and own grocery stores and have kids in our local schools. They are one thing, a sign of the weaknesses of the law that was meant to sort of govern that part of our civic life. Those laws have failed. They weren't applied properly. They didn't work well. And so we have those 14, 15 million people here. The average undocumented person who's been living in the country has been here more than 10 years, on average. That is a totally different problem from the Chinese and Senegalese and Haitians and Cubans and Nicaraguans who are showing up in Nogales and Juarez and Tijuana saying, "Let me in." Those people are a sign of social breakdown in their home countries, which is an international problem. There are tens of millions of people on the move all over the world, and the idea that the United States was just going to blithely sail on without ending up being a shareholder in a worldwide problem is just, a sign of our ongoing naivete. So let's separate out the crisis at the border from solving the problems of the people who are here and coming up with a legal regime for adjudicating and handling those cases, giving the ones who have made long-term commitments and keeping their nose clean some way to stay legally. Solving the problems of the DACA kids was easy. And it's so easy we should have done it a decade ago, but we didn't. So here they are. They're still with us. They're in their 30s now, many of them, and even older. And we have offered them nothing except occasional deadlines that raise their anxiety as it comes and goes, and then some court issues a one weak-kneed ruling that just sort of turns over the clock and we start rolling forward again to some other deadline in the future by which we won't take care of their problems. We, in all kinds of civic realms, assign a different level of responsibility to children for things that get done from adults. We have courts where children are tried, and they're tried in a different way from adults. We have penal systems and confinement for children that's different from adults. We assume in our law, and I'm not a lawyer, but a lot of you are, that there's a different kind of legal responsibility and accountability for things that are done by a child. Yet, we assume, currently in our law, because we won't fix it, that if you are carried over the border as a toddler, you are just as much of a lawbreaker as your parents who are carrying you. Right now, that's the operating legal system. We have to take care, there aren't that many of them. 750,000 young people, many of whom don't speak the language of their quote-unquote native country even very well anymore. They have no memories of it. They didn't grow up there. They didn't go to school there. They are not of that place. And yet, and I profile a couple of them in the book, we continue to make their lives quite difficult and make their American journeys persistently difficult because we will not solve their problem, because our politics are no longer workable on this issue. This is a failure of our elected officials. This is a failure of our system, where there is advantage seen in keeping the problem going rather than solving it. But, will America be changed by letting DACA kids relax, giving them a passport, giving them a regular Social Security number? Are we going to transform the country? Do we have to punish them? I mean, this is where a lot of the conversations are on Capitol Hill right now, to find a way to punish them the way we would publicly spank someone to show the rest of the community that what this person did was wrong. It's really weird. It's a little Hester Prynnish 17th century New England stuff, where we have to do a little public hiding in order to give something good. We have to first punish them. We can't even figure that part out. So, John, I think one way to make all of this easier is to separate out the issues that really have nothing to do with each other any longer, and give the people some relief who need relief right away, whose lives are being made nothing but harder. Acknowledge, for instance, that they do pay billions of dollars of taxes. We keep saying, they pay no taxes. They pay billions of dollars in taxes, in state income taxes, in Social Security tax, in local sales tax. The people who are here illegally are fully participant, because the reason they're here is because they are economic actors in our country. And I'll leave you with this. One of our candidates right now gets a huge hand when he promises that one of the first things out of the gate after the inauguration is mass deportation by armed groups. That he will deputize large numbers of armed and uniformed people who will get millions of people out of the country. And as an abstract proposition, if the fact that they're here really bothers you, if this is something that's really been a burr in your saddle, you think abstractly, good. We'll punish lawbreakers, we'll get this fixed once and for all. But wait till you turn on the television and you see vans with people being dragged out the front door of their houses, and their screaming kids standing on the sidewalk crying and watching them being hustled into vans, and you think about what that's really going to look like in real life, and whether you really want to live in that country. And that's what I'm going to leave you with today, except for one last thing, which is to buy We Are Home. Thank you very much.